Close your eyes and picture a continent where the loudest voices are not those of Washington or Paris, not those of BBC or CNN, but the clear, unshakable voices of children declaring loyalty to their homeland. This is not a scene from a political rally. It is the reality of Burkina Faso, where classrooms have become the new frontier of dignity and sovereignty. For decades, outsiders dismissed this land as fragile, unstable, and irrelevant. Yet in the year when Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed a decree unlike any other, those dismissive whispers were replaced by something powerful: the laughter and conviction of the youth. A law was passed, yes, but it was more than law. It was a seed planted deep in the nation's soil, a seed called patriotic immersion. Books were no longer enough. Knowledge was joined by duty, discipline, and the sacred promise to never betray the flag. Stay with us, for this is not only a headline. It is a turning point in history, and it may mark the beginning of an anti-colonial Africa. Subscribe and walk with this story. The question is simple yet seismic. Is this the rebirth of sovereignty or the first step into dangerous uniformity? When Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed the decree of patriotic immersion, many thought it was simply another regulation in the endless stream of African reforms. But this was not paperwork. This was a proclamation that the nation's very future would be forged not in parliaments, not in palaces, but in classrooms and training grounds. The decree was clear and uncompromising. From this day forward, no student who passes a national exam, whether the general baccalaureate, the vocational training certificate, or the professional studies diploma, would advance to higher education without first completing a period of patriotic immersion. In the past, a diploma alone opened doors. Now it is paired with another passport, a certificate of loyalty, of discipline, of service. At its heart, the reform rests on three pillars. The first is physical training. Students are required to undergo structured exercise and health education, not to prepare for sports alone, but to build resilience, endurance, and the inner steel needed for service to the nation. The second pillar is civic education. Here, the lessons move beyond textbooks into duty, rights, and responsibilities. It is no longer enough to be a subject of the state. Each youth must learn what it means to be its guardian. The third pillar is patriotic lessons. The long and difficult journey of Burkina Faso, from colonization to independence, from coups to fragile hope, becomes part of the curriculum. Young people are reminded that history is not a distant archive. It is the soil from which their own lives are nourished. The decree does not speak in gentle suggestions. It carries teeth. A student who refuses the immersion will not only be barred from further studies, but will also face community service penalties. And yet, even after completing that service, the immersion remains mandatory unless the government grants exemption. This is not a symbolic right. It is the law to be enforced with the coordination of multiple ministries: the Ministry of Secondary Education and Vocational Training, the Ministry of Defense and Veterans, the Ministry of Security, and the Ministry of Higher Education. In short, the classroom and the barracks, the teacher and the soldier, are now partners in shaping the future citizen. Details such as the duration of the program, the training centers where it will be carried out, and the precise curriculum are to be defined through joint ministerial orders. But one thing is already certain. At the end of this journey, each student will receive a certificate as vital as any diploma. Without it, there is no path forward, no vocational school, no university, no professional qualification. For some, this sounds like a heavy burden. It asks the youth not only to study, but also to prove themselves through service. Yet within that burden lies an opportunity. It offers more than credentials. It offers identity. Young Burkinabe will no longer be divided by region, by ethnicity, or by party allegiance. They will share the same rite of passage, the same training, the same loyalty. It is a vision of a generation born not into fragmentation, but into unity. Parents have begun to whisper of a quiet pride. For years, they feared their sons and daughters would abandon the country for Europe or America, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Now they imagine their children marching beneath the flag, learning its history, carrying its burdens. Teachers, too, sense that something has shifted. No longer are they conveyor belts pushing students toward diplomas alone. They are guardians of a deeper mission, to prepare citizens as well as workers. What Ibrahim Traoré has planted is more than a curriculum. It is a seed that, if nurtured, could grow into a forest of loyalty. The law declares that the youth of Burkina Faso shall not only read history, they shall live it, defend it, and carry it forward. And yet, one question lingers. Heavy as a storm cloud over this hopeful dawn, is this decree the soil of empowerment, or could it harden into the chains of conformity? The decree might have remained just ink on paper, a distant law debated in offices and classrooms. But the moment it leapt into life came not from ministries or officials, but from the unfiltered voices of children. Cameras captured them, some in neatly pressed uniforms, others in worn sandals, raising their voices in a chorus that stunned even hardened observers. We will never betray our country. We are loyal to our flag. We have the best president in the world. This was not a staged rally. The rough edges of their voices, the unpolished accents, the sheer conviction etched on their faces, it carried a truth impossible to script. For decades, the world had told itself that African youth were disillusioned, restless, desperate to leave their homelands. Yet here was Burkina Faso's next generation declaring the opposite, a fierce loyalty to land and leader. In that moment, policy became passion and decree became movement. Parents who heard these voices felt something stir. Many had lived through instability, through coups and betrayal, through the gnawing fear that their sacrifices would vanish in the next political storm. For them, the voices of their children were a vindication, a sign that their struggles might not be in vain. Teachers too felt uplifted. Once reduced to conveyor belts toward examinations, they now stood as mentors of nationhood. Soldiers entrusted with securing the program saw in the youth's enthusiasm a legitimacy stronger than any order. The images traveled fast. Within days, local television replayed the scenes, social media carried them across West Africa, and talk shows in Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda debated their meaning. In Ghana, commentators admitted that their schools had failed to produce such loyalty. In Uganda and Cameroon, where presidents had ruled longer than many citizens had lived, the thought that children could speak of their leader with such hope seemed almost unimaginable. In Kenya, where the news cycle is dominated by protest and accusation, the voices from Burkina Faso sounded like a broadcast from another planet. It was not just admiration. It was also challenge. The broadcast turned outward, asking other African nations directly, "Can your children say this about your president?" The question cut deep. It was less about Ibrahim Traoré himself and more about the nature of leadership, what it takes to inspire genuine loyalty among the young. The emotional peak arrived when the children's voices were interlaced with Traoré's own message. Addressing the youth directly, he warned them of manipulation by foreign powers. The new Burkina Faso, he declared, needs new patriotism and new citizens. His words were sharp, almost martial. The ignorance that once enabled imperial domination could no longer be tolerated. Discipline, unity, and knowledge would be the shield of the next generation. Across Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, murals began to appear. Loyal to our flag. The future belongs to the brave. These were not slogans imposed by a ministry, but street art born from enthusiasm. Online, hashtags spread across Francophone Africa, celebrating what some called a new dawn. To many Africans, the children's declarations became more than praise for one leader. They became proof that leadership could still evoke authentic love. And yet not all responses were celebratory. Western media outlets sounded alarms. To them, patriotic immersion looked uncomfortably like militarization of youth. Critics warned that such programs could stifle dissent, turning education into indoctrination. Some feared that blind nationalism, once planted, could grow into a dangerous rigidity. But these critiques, while loud, were soon drowned in the tide of African voices praising the reform. For many across the continent, the question was simple. If one of Africa's poorest nations could ignite such pride in its youth, what excuse did others have? The decree had crossed a threshold. It was no longer only about schooling, not only about a certificate. It had become a cultural revolution, a movement binding children, parents, teachers, and soldiers into a single chorus. The spark had been lit. The question was how far the flame would spread. And as the voices of children echoed across borders, a new unease began to rise. How would the world beyond Africa respond to this surge of loyalty? The immediate consequence of Ibrahim Traoré's decree was not measured in classrooms alone, but in households across Burkina Faso. Parents, who for years had spoken of migration as the only escape, began to whisper of a future worth staying for. No longer was education simply a conveyor belt leading to diplomas and then to emigration. Now, before their children could step into universities or vocational schools, they would first carry the flag, march with discipline, and learn the nation's history. This shift offered parents something priceless, assurance that the sacrifices of their generation would not be forgotten. Teachers, long trapped in the frustration of underfunded schools and unmotivated students, also sensed a rebirth of dignity. Their profession was no longer limited to imparting technical knowledge. Instead, they became custodians of a larger mission, forming citizens who carried the weight of history as well as the tools of modern education. Civic duty, once a neglected chapter at the back of the curriculum, now stood at the center of national identity. To many educators, this was liberation. They were not merely training workers, but shaping patriots. For the youth themselves, the reform carried both pressure and pride. The pressure was evident. Advancement was impossible without immersion. Skipping it meant not only community service penalties, but also the risk of being branded disloyal. Yet alongside this burden came a new pride. Completing the immersion was not a bureaucratic hurdle, it was a badge of honor. It became a brotherhood and sisterhood, a rite of passage binding Burkinabe youth together across regions and ethnicities. To stand before one's peers with a certificate of patriotic immersion was to say, I stood for my country before I stood for myself. Politically, the decree struck at the very roots of division. Across much of Africa, loyalty flows first to political parties, ethnic groups, or foreign patrons. Traoré sought to invert that order. Loyalty must flow first to the nation, to the shared flag, to the soil that binds all citizens. Leaders may rise and fall, parties may fracture, but the nation must endure. This principle, if internalized by a whole generation, could reshape Burkina Faso's political culture for decades to come. The impact went further. For years, Burkina Faso had struggled with instability, coups, and the heavy hand of foreign interference. Now, with one decree, the government declared that children would grow up resistant to manipulation. By teaching them history and discipline, it aimed to create citizens who could not easily be swayed by propaganda or bribed by promises of foreign sponsors. It was, in essence, the blueprint for a new social contract, one where betrayal of the country would be unthinkable even if political disagreements remained. Yet no reform comes without risk. Some critics inside the country warned that patriotic immersion might blur the line between patriotism and obedience. Could dissent be painted as disloyalty? Could future leaders exploit the program to demand blind conformity? The line was thin, and history was filled with examples of states where civic training curdled into coercion. But for now, in the streets of Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, the immediate effect was a surge of civic pride and cohesion. This is why observers have called it more than education. It is a national strategy, a shield against division, a foundation for what some already name an anti-colonial Africa. For the first time in many years, Burkina Faso was not being spoken of as a passive recipient of foreign aid or a pawn in global games. It was being discussed as an innovator, a nation daring to redefine the bond between citizen and state. The consequences were not just civic, not just political. They were deeply emotional. Parents felt hope. Teachers felt dignity. Youth felt identity. And the state, for the first time in a generation, felt legitimacy rooted not in elites or armies, but in the unprompted voices of children. Yet beyond Burkina Faso's borders, powerful eyes were watching. How would the world respond to a youth raised on sovereignty rather than submission? When the decree of patriotic immersion was announced, the world did not stay silent. In Washington, policymakers examined it with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some commentators praised the emphasis on civic education, recalling that the early United States itself had compulsory civic training as part of nation building. But beneath the polite words lay concern. A generation of Burkinabe raised to question Western narratives and resist foreign manipulation would be far harder to sway in future negotiations. For America, the risk was not military. It was the erosion of soft power. In France, the reaction was sharper, almost wounded. For decades, Paris had relied on cultural and political ties to maintain influence in West Africa, often through education systems shaped in its own image. Now, Burkina Faso's decree was seen as an explicit rejection of that legacy. If Burkinabe youth were taught from adolescence to distrust external interference, the traditional channels of French influence, scholarships, elite schools, francophone cultural prestige could wither. For many in Paris, patriotic immersion was not only about classrooms. It was a warning that the old order of Francafrique was crumbling. Across Africa, the reform sparked intense debate. In Ghana, journalists admitted that their schools had failed to instill patriotism, leaving citizens more loyal to parties than to the nation. In Kenya, where political protests dominate headlines, commentators wondered aloud whether such a program could heal their fractured youth. In Uganda and Cameroon, the question was painful. Would children in those countries ever speak of their leaders with the same conviction Burkina Faso children showed toward Ibrahim Traoré? The decree also drew comparisons beyond Africa. Some Western analysts likened it to China's patriotic education, raising speculation that Burkina Faso might be drifting toward an Eastern model of governance. Others saw it as a bold experiment in asserting independence, not eastward or westward, but inward, towards sovereignty defined by Africans themselves. Reactions were divided, but one reality became undeniable. The decree had put Burkina Faso on the map as a laboratory of political innovation. In a global order where small nations are often treated as spectators, here was a country daring to write its own script. Supporters hailed it as the seed of African sovereignty. Critics dismissed it as indoctrination, but whether celebrated or condemned, it was noticed. And as attention swelled, so too did the stakes. For if Burkina Faso stood firm, could others follow? And would the world's powers tolerate such defiance? The decree of patriotic immersion is only the beginning. What lies ahead for Burkina Faso, and perhaps for Africa, depends on how this seed is nurtured. One path leads to a renaissance. If the program succeeds, a generation will grow up with discipline in their bodies, history in their minds, and pride in their hearts. They will be harder to manipulate, less tempted by the promises of foreign sponsors, less vulnerable to divisions of ethnicity or party. In this vision, Burkina Faso becomes more than a small landlocked nation. It becomes a beacon of renewal, a place where sovereignty is not an abstract slogan, but a lived reality. Children who once might have dreamt of fleeing abroad could instead dream of building at home. Teachers could stand tall as guardians of national identity. Parents could believe, at last, that the soil of their struggle will yield a harvest of dignity. Yet another path carries risk. Programs of loyalty can inspire, but they can also harden. If future leaders twist patriotic immersion into blind nationalism, dissent may be silenced in the name of unity. The same certificate that today feels like a badge of honor could one day become a tool of conformity. History warns us that the line between education and indoctrination is perilously thin. What begins as empowerment can, under different hands, become control. Between these two futures lies the challenge. Burkina Faso must balance pride with openness, discipline with freedom, loyalty with critical thought. The decree is a tool, not a destiny. Its impact will depend on whether it produces citizens who love their country enough to question it, to improve it, and to defend it. The stakes extend far beyond Ouagadougou. Across Africa, eyes are watching. If Burkina Faso's model flourishes, it may inspire others to experiment with their own paths toward dignity and independence. But if it falters, if it collapses into rigidity or is crushed by external pressure, it may serve as a cautionary tale. The question is whether this bold step will remain isolated within one nation or ripple outward, shaping a continent. What is certain is this: the road is long and the journey uncertain. But for the youth of Burkina Faso, the immersion is not merely training, it is initiation. They are stepping onto a road where their voices, their loyalty, and their courage will decide the fate of a nation. And at the end of that road lies the ultimate question: will the forest born of this seed grow strong enough to withstand the storms of the world? In the echoes of children's voices, in the silence of Western headlines, something irreversible has begun in Burkina Faso. A decree that started as policy has transformed into a symbol of pride, of defiance, of a nation reclaiming its own image. Patriotic immersion is no longer just about education. It is about memory, identity, and the refusal to be defined by others. For decades, Africa has been told what to think, how to vote, what to teach. Now, in classrooms and training fields, in murals and chants, Burkina Faso is answering back. Not with violence, not with protest, but with preparation for a future led by citizens who remember where they came from and refuse to be bought, divided, or erased. This is not naivety. The risks are real. The road ahead is steep, but perhaps in this fragile, hopeful experiment, we are witnessing the foundation of something the world has rarely seen: an anti-colonial Africa built not on anger, but on agency, not on slogans, but on structure, not on dependency, but on dignity. The question that remains is not only for Burkina Faso, it is for the world. Will this model be isolated, resisted, or replicated? Can a nation's youth be trained to defend its values without falling into blind conformity? Can patriotism be taught without extinguishing dissent? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because what is happening in Burkina Faso may not stay in Burkina Faso. If you believe that education should serve the people, not the powers, if you believe in African sovereignty rooted in truth, not in tradition, then share this video. Comment your thoughts and subscribe, not for content, but for a conversation that dares to ask, what kind of Africa do we want to become? Let it be known from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, from Accra to Addis, that a nation once dismissed as peripheral is now shaping the center of the conversation. And it all began with the children who refused to look away.